We're going to be talking about medical marijuana, and are you ready for today's new reality? Sapoznik Insurance is an agency that believes in education and developing all kinds of strategies, not only for our employers and employees, but also for our community. There's a lot of changes that are going on, and we'd like to be at the forefront of those changes, whether it's multicultural generations working together, whether it's understanding alternative funding mechanisms to help you save in healthcare costs. I'm very excited to welcome our sponsors. We have Greenspoon Marder as one of our sponsors, and HRABC, which is the Health Resources Association. They have been wonderful sponsors, and we believe that this topic is so present and ready for everyone to start to learn about. I'm going to turn it over now to have each one of our panelists introduce themselves. So, Adam.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up with us bright and early. Beautiful city of Boca Raton. My name is Adam Kemper. I'm a labor and employment law attorney with the law firm Greenspoon Marder, LLP. We're a full-service law firm with offices throughout the country. But I specialize in working with companies to take proactive measures to avoid workplace litigation, from hiring to termination to everything in between. Also work on workplace policies, medical marijuana compliance, and that's certainly an interesting topic, one in which I've spoken about before. But the interesting thing about that is, if you've been to my presentation before, today it's going to be a little different because I have some updates from the last one. So very excited to share with you my insights this morning, and I look forward to an interactive discussion with you guys.
Anna.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna Alfonso, and I am the President and CEO of Workforce Dynamics Consulting. My role is to build strategies for companies that help them navigate rapid change. And with that in mind, this is certainly a topic that is going to impact businesses and create a lot of rapid change. So I welcome you all, and I'm glad that there's so much interest in this topic. Thank you.
David.
Good morning. Happy to be here. Good to see all of you here too. I am the Director of HR for Broward County, and I think this is a fascinating topic, and all of you are here too, then I'm going to assume you feel the same way. So I hope we can walk out here with a few answers.
Perfect. We're going to get started. Adam, why do employers need to really be aware of medical marijuana laws?
So if I could just start by addressing the room. By show of hands, how many people are in HR here? Okay, so the majority of the room, I think it's safe to say. And I think it's also safe to say that HR has never been more difficult. It's never been more challenging, and you've never been responsible for knowing as much as you do now. So, 3 years ago, Rachel and I were talking about transgender rights in the workplace and how to handle the bathroom situation. A couple weeks ago, I was talking about the Me Too movement and employer obligations in that regard. And now we're talking about medical marijuana in the workplace. And this goes back to you in HR. This is yet another piece of information that you have to learn, that you have to become educated about, because you are going to have these situations in your workplace. So the question is, how are you going to handle it? And I'm hopeful that today we'll be able to share some insights with you that will help you address, how to handle these situations, because now more than ever before, you have this additional responsibility to your company to address this situation appropriately. Otherwise, there could be a potential lawsuit that you'll have to deal with. So employers need to be aware of these laws because it's a new area to address. It's a new issue in your workplace, and HR needs to be prepared to handle that.
Anna, as we think about this, what are some of the recommendations that you would make as an employer, as HR? What do they need to start to look at from being ready for taking a position in this new world?
Well, I think it's safe to say that this is a topic that is going to impact every single business here in Florida. And the sooner you start thinking about being prepared, this is already happening. It's not going to happen in the future. And you have to think about the fact that it's a growing industry here in Florida. By the year 2020, they project it's going to be $1 billion industry, and this is just on the medical marijuana. Socially acceptable, about 85% of the public accept that medical marijuana should be used in healthcare treating patients. So this is something that's here to stay. It's too late to think about getting started. You really should have already a strategy, and it should be a long-range strategy where you're looking at this in the potential for increased utilization if it at some point becomes socially acceptable, if at some point down the road it becomes federally acceptable. So how are you going to handle it? How do your businesses operate right now? What is the best approach that you can take to creating a strategy that's inclusive but also controls your risk? And you need to think about perhaps the type of work that your business does. Is it positions where safety is a concern? All these things have to be discussed and a strategy prepared that really takes into account your risk but also your inclusiveness.
David, you are the HR director of one of the largest employers. How is your organization looking at drug testing? How are they looking at it as compared to the legalization of marijuana? And what are some of the things that Broward County is doing to deal with the employees?
That was a good question. I'm going to start with a question for all of you. Who here has a drug-free policy in their workplace? Who here's, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Whose policy directly discusses marijuana, medical marijuana? And that seems to be the national trend. In preparing for today, we were looking at the policies of Broward County, and specifically, I directed my team, I want you to research all over the country. Go private, go public. I want to know what companies are doing and what are the trends we're seeing for medical marijuana in the workplace. They found that almost nobody has a policy directly discussing medical marijuana. And I'm including the states where recreational marijuana is allowed. They have not changed their policies in many respects. Some have said we're going to go with the federal standard and say marijuana is not legal and we're not going to allow it. Others are saying our states are allowing it. Both are saying we're not going to touch our policy, we're just going to leave it alone. This is led, but that's not how Broward County wants to conduct itself. We're not just going to ignore it. So we are actually revising our policy right now, and we are in the early stages, but I feel optimistic because many people aren't in any stages. But we're in the early stages of making this decision, and we hope to have our policy completed in the next few months.
Some of the conditions that people use medical marijuana, we should become aware of. So I have a listing here of just a few of them. But people can get medical marijuana cards for not only glaucoma, cancer, HIV, epilepsy, chronic injury, chronic pain. So when we start to think about the type of illnesses that individuals are receiving the medical marijuana card, it comes into play with HIPAA. How are we going to deal with the HIPAA legislation? So my question to Adam is, can an employer legally terminate an employee who tests positive for marijuana in Florida that has a medical marijuana card?
So this is the $64 million question. I think this is the question everybody wants an answer to, including every one of my clients, and they hate when I give this response, but it depends. What I can tell you is from the time I knew I was doing this presentation today to today, there is a new lawsuit in the state of Florida, and it's against the city of Miami, of all employers. And it actually was filed the end of August, and the city of Miami responded to it just recently, just last month. And the very issue in the case, and this is our Florida precedent that we're dealing with, is whether or not you can terminate somebody for for using medical marijuana in violation of the drug-free workplace. And the plaintiff in this case is taking the position that there's no statutory violation of the medical marijuana laws, but the plaintiff decided to go under what's called the Florida Civil Rights Act to sue for disability discrimination, alleging that it wasn't the medical marijuana as the reason why I was fired, it was the disability. This is taken by a very, very reputable plaintiff's firm in Miami. I'm very familiar with them. And, you know, it's currently pending in court. So this is going to be our precedent for the state of Florida, and I think we ought to keep a close eye on the case. It's McDuffie v. City of Miami. And everybody wants to know how City of Miami responded. Well, the City of Miami says, plaintiff has failed to state a cause of action in this case. It's frivolous from the outset, and the city is entitled to its attorney's fees. So the city is taking a very strong position in this case that it's a frivolous lawsuit. As a government employer and drug-free workplace, the city is exempt from any of the provisions found, and they cite to the medical marijuana statute. And then there's a couple of other defenses that they've mentioned here. So the city's taking the position that, yes, they 100% can fire this person for violating the drug-free policy, and I agree with the city.
So
Okay.
now they had their prescription or their card or whatever for the marijuana?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be the same as somebody that's on Oxy with a prescription?
I mean, some people are taking that position.
That's my position.
Okay. And I get that, and here they're not even taking that position. They're saying it wasn't the medical marijuana, it was the underlying disability, and that's because the Florida statute specifically says that the section does not create a cause of action against an employer for wrongful discharge or discrimination. So you can't even use the Florida statute to support a claim for discharge if you've been using medical marijuana. So the only avenue you have in the state of Florida is this disability statute under the Florida Civil Rights Act. And they didn't go under federal law because we know under federal law marijuana is illegal. So this is the case that we all need to keep a close eye on. It's brand new, literally last month or 2 months ago. So to answer your question, I agree with the city here. I say you can enforce a drug-free policy. You can terminate somebody for violating that policy under the state of Florida. But let's see what the judge does here, and let's see what the precedent is in the coming months.
Anna, during this time that we're all looking at unemployment at its lowest level, and recruiting and retention is a challenge, what are the benefits of having a cannabis-friendly corporate culture? We got to keep it light, okay? We got to keep it light.
I want to know how many in the room, since a lot of you said you were from HR, are having difficulty recruiting in this market. So imagine now 85% of the public is accepting or feel that they can stand behind medical marijuana for medical purposes. And you're trying to recruit someone, and your ad has a caption at the bottom that says we're a drug-free workplace, and whatever else you want to put on there. And you want to make sure that people applying know that you do not want cannabis in your workplace, that you are going to be a strict workplace. This is going to even reduce your ability to hire. For one thing, if the public is accepting, then from a perception standpoint, they may think that you're not the employer that they want to work with. So you have to address all of these new issues before you create a strategy about cannabis in your workplace. But you should consider that cannabis-friendly workplace is the way of the future. In this world that we live, I mean, tomorrow Florida could be one of those states where it's socially acceptable, and how are you going to not hire a top performer because a month ago he was in a state even today, was in a state where marijuana is socially legal, and he had marijuana. And it's like, now he's coming to you a month later, and he's going to test positive, potentially, for the marijuana. So think about these possibilities as you build your strategy and your policy, because I think in the way that we need to move forward with this, and this is something I tell my clients, is you got to have a long-range view. You got to see that this is coming. I mean, look at Canada, second country in the world that has legalized marijuana. So you have to take a long-range view when you approach your policies, your strategies with this. And you have to think of the impact to your business. You have to grow that business. You have to be able to recruit. You have to be able to keep the business going. So I urge you to manage the risk against the possibility that you have a business to run.
David, from the employer standpoint, how does medical marijuana really differ from other prescription drugs?
Really, I would say from an employer perspective, it doesn't. And it's about, but the answer here is to be consistent. First, as the employer, you need to decide, or we need to decide, are we abiding by state law or the federal law? If we decide that we're going by state, then I would say you treat that the way you would treat every other prescription medication. If you're going by federal, you need to be consistent in being a drug-free workplace that does not allow marijuana, and consistency is the key word here. And it's no different than any policy we have.
So then I have a question. If you are taking the route of consistency, and you have an organization, unlike yours, which is concentrated here in Florida, but you have an organization that has offices in different states, where in different states you are, following the state law, and in this state it says no, in this state it says yes. How can you address consistency in that situation?
I'm going to go with that and say, once again, consistency. Do you have different policies in different states for your organization? I've overseen HR in national companies, and for the most part, we've taken one policy, and then we take the most conservative policy across all the states. We might have one or two minor differences. Other organizations, they have one policy for everybody, and it's for everybody. So I would say, what does your organization do now? Do you have different policies for different states? And if you do, I would say this is no different. If you're saying we're going with one policy for everybody, then you go with the most conservative policy language you have.
Two quick things. One is, it's very important to differentiate between safety-sensitive positions and non-safety-sensitive positions. So we hear the term medical marijuana, and everybody assuming people are going to be coming to work high, even the crane operators. Well, that's not the case. The other question is pertaining to one of Florida's largest employers, AutoNation. As many of you probably know, AutoNation removed marijuana from their drug panel. I was wondering, what is your opinion on something like that for employers in this room? Should they consider removing marijuana from their drug panel? Should they separate safety-sensitive positions from non-safety-sensitive positions?
So that's a choice, I think, that you have to make based on a lot of criteria. For example, you mentioned some of them. Are they safety positions? Are these positions clerical in nature? You need to look at a number of factors before you decide that this is the way you want to go. AutoNation obviously has already done that work, and they've chosen to take that position. The one thing I want to tell everybody in this room is you as an employer are entitled to a reasonable expectation that people will not show up to work impaired. That is whether they work, whether they're an engineer working on the computer or an IT person, you still have a reasonable expectation that the essential job functions are being performed by someone who's thinking clearly, because that your other workers have a right to drug-free working. They have a right to working alongside other people and not feel that they may be impaired. So as HR, this is going to come down to a burden on you, unfortunately, that you need to help your managers understand how to manage under these conditions.
Having preparation and really understanding how to deal with these situations is really important. We had a show of hands of the number of people here that are in HR, and I would say almost 90% of the people here are in HR. One of the mechanisms that HR uses to really establish protocol is the employee handbook. What should we be doing to take a look at our employee handbook, and how do we protect ourselves as employers to make sure that handbook is addressing or not addressing this issue?
You know what your policy is. What is the culture of your organization, and what is their tolerance for allowing medical marijuana in the workplace? Once you know that, the policies tend to write themselves. That they don't, you all write them, but you know what I mean. And it's determining whether or not it should be in your drug panel. It's determining whether or not you do pre-employment drug testing. If you do not do, and many organizations these days are not doing that anymore. They don't find that it's relevant to the day-to-day work. That is not necessarily true for safety-sensitive positions, and they keep the policies in place for workers' comp. So if there's an injury, if there's an accident, they do drug testing at that time.
So for HR, if you have an employee that is diagnosed with Parkinson's, long-standing employee, great employee, they are using medical marijuana, and they have a slip and fall on the workers' comp, how would that be treated?
Well, we were talking about that right before the panel, because marijuana stays in your system for 30 days, but Adam was saying that the technology is getting to the point where they can determine how long that marijuana has been in your system. So it can determine whether or not you were smoking it over the weekend, or if it's been in your system in the last 12-ish hours. I think that makes a difference for the workers. Obviously, it does make a difference for the workers' comp. Many employers promote themselves as being a drug-free workplace, and they really aren't. They don't follow the laws. They don't follow the policies. And I'm not saying you should have a big sign that says we allow marijuana in our workplace. Come apply here. It's. But many employers are not following those laws to the T, and they aren't even trying to get the 5%. They have a thing in their policy in their handbook that says it's a drug-free workplace, but they don't strictly adhere to what that actually means. And regardless of what our final decision is on medical marijuana, we're still going to say we're a drug-free workplace because
we feel we are.
Because we have plenty of drugs that we're still not going to allow at the workplace.
So the question is, if you have an employee who has a medical marijuana card, let's say in Florida, they're going on a work trip to a state that does not recognize medical marijuana or will not recognize their medical marijuana card, how do you handle that? Do you send them on the trip? Very good question. What I would say is you still need to abide by a state's laws, because if you send that employee to a state and they violate that state's laws, then they can get in trouble, they can get arrested, and then you're worse off than sending that employee, than not sending that employee to that state. So that's, I would say you need to abide by that state's laws. That would be my response to that.
From an employer standpoint, I would say you can do that research for the employee. You let them know what those state laws are, where they're going, and ultimately they're accountable for their actions when they go. And if they tell you before they go, you know what, I can't go a day without marijuana. Whatever I have is the pain is just too great. I can't do it. They're the ones who are going to turn down that opportunity, not you telling them they can't do it.
And what David is saying is let them make the choice, because not going on a work trip could down the line impact you in maybe a promotion or a pay raise. And how's that going to be looked at? So I think David's position was excellent in saying, here's the facts, you, Mr. or Miss Employee, you make the decision as to whether or not you can go or are able to go. So I think that's very important.
Just one comment about the employees that are traveling or being asked to travel. The bottom line is, if they're taking medical marijuana with them, whether it's in a car, boat, plane, train, federal laws are going to apply. So educate the employee to the fact that it doesn't matter if they're going to a state that doesn't allow it and they live in a state that does allow the medical marijuana. At the end of the day, federal, no pun intended, trumps state. And as a result, they have to be aware that they're taking a personal risk when they travel. if they choose to take that assignment.
Actually, that's a very good point. And the other thing I want to point out is that if that trip is a job requirement, then are you fulfilling the essential job functions?
So,
Perhaps at that point, the employee could be told that, hey, that doesn't work. Can your physician recommend something else?
and/or
Because of
if
your
it is a
job.
part of your responsibility on a regular basis, we may need to revisit your position and whether or not this is something you're going to be able to handle long-term.
One additional point that I want to throw out there in respect to this hypothetical is, how many employers like when their employees are arrested? My show of hands. Okay, so the reason why I make that point is because, if someone violates another state law, they're arrested, they're thrown in jail, that could come back to the employer. There could be a negative press result as a result of that.
It will.
So I do think there needs to be a dialogue there.
Yep.
If the employee is going to be crossing state lines, certainly if they violate their own law on their own time, that's up to them. But if they're on the employer time and they're going on a work trip, then they need to abide by those laws. Otherwise, the employer could be at risk.
So I just want to frame the question. Your question is, you get funding, the funding that you get for the non-for-profit organization has requirements about drug-free workplace. And how will that impact future
Not
funding?
only funding, but licensing, for example, the Department of Children and Families, or things like that.
Well, some of those are safety-sensitive organizations,
Right.
and if you're working with children, that's probably not going to change anytime soon, for example. But if they're federal grants, they're going to have federal law, and you're going to be bound by whatever the federal law is. My advice would be find some different funders, because if that's a concern for you, and you don't want to abide by those standards, you're going to need to find grants that provide you more flexibility.
How can framing the conversation with the manager avoid mishandling these situations? So
I feel with this room, this is a loaded question now, but I'm going to try. I really think that the best thing you can do is direct your managers to come to HR if they have a question, just like anything else. If something new comes up with the employees and they are unsure of how it should be handled, then that's a question for HR, and HR really needs to perhaps seek additional counsel to make sure that the proper steps are taken. Because what you don't want to do is act rashly and open yourself up to other liabilities.
I would say the same thing. They need to have an open dialogue with HR, and then let HR take the baton and do what needs to be done, but don't leave that at the manager level.
So do you see a difference when you think about HIPAA? If somebody's on high blood pressure medicine and they tell their manager, I'm on high blood pressure medicine, do you see a difference between something like that and medical marijuana?
On a personal level, I'm going to separate these. On a personal level, yes, I do see a difference. I think there's a big difference between, there is a difference between something that's more of a painkiller or something that eases pain versus something that you're taking because if you don't, your insulin goes through the roof and you're going to die. So or asthma or whatever it is. I do distinguish between the two. Putting my HR hat on, no. HIPAA is HIPAA. It does not distinguish between the two, and that's harsh.
I would probably agree. If someone is telling you that they're taking marijuana versus telling you that they're taking insulin, I would still treat those as confidential information and don't cross the HIPAA.
What do you think the likelihood is that the person's going to tell you? I mean, as a human resources professional, if they need some accommodation, they might come to you.
She's saying they're not going to tell you. Who here in HR has had an employee tell them something they actually did not want to know?
But many times, many things they don't tell you because they think you are going to discriminate against them. If I'm taking Zoloft for anxiety, they're not going to give me the big job.
But with the medical marijuana card, there is that feeling of I'm protected.
Right.
So I can do what I want, and I'll tell you.
When something happens.
I'll tell you now. I'm proud of it. I've got the card. Why not? now I'm protected. There's nothing you can do. That's the feeling that I feel a lot of employees may have. Every employee will not tell you, but there are plenty who will. The question was during an interview, if an employee tells you that they have a card and then they don't get the job and they are claiming some form of discrimination because of that. I mean, I was in an interview yesterday. Talked about their kids, talked about their religion, talked about... I did not ask. From those, so it's about having documentation in place, being able to justify why you hired the person that you hired, and showing qualifications. No different than any other issue that you don't want to know in an interview.
So what I tell my clients is you should always have, based on the position you're interviewing for, you should have a set of questions and a grading system so that you, as well as all the other managers that have to interview that person, can give you a grading system, and then you select the individual based on the higher qualifications. And if you have that consistent process all the time, that will not be something, you can defend something like that.
And to David's point, if you're having interview notes and maybe you're identifying in the notes why the person is not qualified for the position, have them contemporaneous, do them at the time of the interview. You can go back and explain it, why they're not qualified if you choose to, or you can just say you're not qualified for the position. I would not recommend you say you're not a good fit, because that comment has actually been litigated now, because everything's litigated these days, but
So what would you say in place of that?
I would say not qualified.
Okay.
So, and this is actually a good point for everybody here. Attorneys are going to be pushing the envelope in these cases to try and create new law, create new precedent. Do you want to be the test case? You gotta kind of be mindful of the climate we're dealing in now. Everything is so brand new that people are going to test the law, and the definitions of the law, possibly against your companies. So you need to be prepared for that. And if you want to go the long haul with it too, to say, we're going to take a stand that we should be able to fire people for violating our drug-free workplace policy, or in most cases settle, and this might settle as well.
One thing that seems very confusing with a lot of employers and patients is that Florida has two types of medical marijuana. One is called, under Florida law, is called low THC medical marijuana. The other is called medical marijuana that has THC. My question is, most people are not separating the two. So for an example, an employer might have a patient who has seizures, epilepsy, and that patient is using low THC cannabis, which is CBD basically. Do you think employers should dig deeper? And we talked about carve-outs and policy separating the two, because one is euphoric and one is not?
I think that you are really walking that fine line of HIPAA, because that information now is going to be related to direct medical conditions. And now, for whatever reason, that person needs to be terminated for other reasons other than their medical conditions. You're opening up this whole HIPAA ruling. So the position that the employer takes as to whether or not you want to have a drug-free workforce needs to be taken if that's something that you want to do. The position, if you are willing to have a workforce that is not a drug-free workforce, then that position, somehow you need to take that position and then follow the position. But I think if you follow the position and then you dissect it, you open yourself up to HIPAA violations. I just have a question, because I keep going back to the handbook. As HR professionals, would you recommend anything about this issue in your handbook, or addressing the issue?
Like I said before, first you have to know what your policy is going to be. And I think I'm not suggesting you a policy that says we allow marijuana in the workplace. You just might not mention in the language when you're saying we test for illegal drugs. And you can still have a policy and still have your same language, probably that you have now, that says we do not allow for illegal drugs. And an illegal drug can include a prescription drug that you don't have a prescription for. That's an illegal drug. I would say, if you're breaking down all the drugs that people aren't allowed to take right now, your policy book must be about this big. So I would say keep your policy, keep it broad and say we do not allow for illegal drugs.
All right, as we come to a close, I'd like each one of my panelists, start with Adam, to give us one takeaway that would be beneficial for us in continuing on our educational journey of the world of medical marijuana.
So the fourth quarter for many of us is the busiest time of year, and I also look at it as a perfect time for HR to consider what policies, what changes they're going to be making in the workplace come 2019. And it's often my busiest time of year because I'm working with many of you on changes that you'd like to make, on restructuring that you'd like to make. This is a perfect topic that you can examine in terms of how is your company going to be treating this in 2019. Okay? Go back, look at what your handbook says. What does it say on drug policy? How often are you drug testing, if at all? What procedures in place do you have with management to monitor behavior which might be out of the ordinary? Go back, examine these issues, and think about how you want to treat them for 2019. And I'm happy to offer my service in working with you guys on that area.
Well, I think it's a great opportunity for HR to be at the forefront of this topic. So what I'd like to suggest is that if you haven't done so already, go back to your leadership. Talk about what is right for your workplace. And start drafting those policies, but also that training that you're going to provide to your hiring managers on how to conduct an efficient interview without, adding risk to the company by questions that they may not be ready for. Engage, support, either legal support, a third-party consultant support in helping you see the perspective from all angles so that you can write something that is going to be meaningful for your business, but also it's going to protect your employer brand. It's going to be reasonable to enforce, and something that is going to control your risk. It really depends on your risk tolerance at that point. But look at all the issues. This is a multi-factor type of discussion, and you definitely have to have it sooner than later with your leadership of your organization and make sure that your position is known by your employees.
I haven't been to an HR event yet where someone doesn't mention have a seat at the table or be strategic, so I'll be that guy right now. If you're going to be strategic, you need to do your homework. So you need to know what is your industry doing, what are their practices. You need to look at your current policy, you need to look at your funding sources, you need to consider your culture, and then you need to go to your CEO and have a recommendation for what you want to do. And maybe that recommendation is we keep it the way it is, but I think you need to have that open dialogue and decide how we're going to address this. And that CEO may say, you know what, I want to open it up and allow this, or that CEO may say, you know what, I want to clamp down. But that individual can't make the most informed decision if you haven't done your homework and bring that to them and have that conversation.
What's the trend? I mean, in terms of the HR community, are they more for the flexibility of the medical marijuana, or sticking to that whole old school kind of mentality where it's like it's a taboo in public, but behind it seems like a different story of opinion? Where are we with the HR community in your opinion?
What I'm seeing,
Hearing?
what I'm hearing, right now the trend is let's see what everyone else is doing.
I was going to say the trend is there is no trend.
Okay.
This stuff is brand new. This is actually a great time for us to be the innovators. For us to consider our own workplace policies, which potentially other employers down the road can look to many of you and say, wow, that's a pretty good policy. So I think we're all in a great position to be those innovators.
I'll give you some perspective. My clients range from a company that has 4 employees to a company that has probably like over 1,000 employees. Everyone is different. Some people have, the attitude of, I don't want to know what my employees are doing. They come in every day performance is great, innovation is great, they're engaged, and that's all I care about. What they do at home is their business. And other people who depend on federal funding or perhaps have those sensitive positions or healthcare positions, they are more concerned with the safety of all the employees, and rightly so. So this is why I go back and urge you to have a conversation for what's best for your business, and then decide how much your tolerance is for the policy that you're going to write, and write a policy that's right for you.
So I'd like to thank my panelists, Adam Kemper, Anna, and David. You guys were terrific. I also would like to thank everyone that attended. At Sapoznik Insurance, we do believe in education. Healthcare costs continue to increase. We don't know, but down the line, medical marijuana could be one of those areas that could help contain healthcare costs. And that could be something that we could be looking at in the future, because it does allow employees to come back to work that are in chronic pain, that may have other medical conditions. We could see a reduction in disability claims. We could see a reduction in medical pharmaceutical claims. So we really don't know the avenue, and that's why we feel as an organization, as a company, that we must have an open mind about it, learn about it, and continue to monitor it. Anyone that would like to continue to get information about this topic, please give us your business card, and we'll be happy to put you on our mailing list so we can update you on that and give you the additional latest and greatest of what's going on with employers. And we're just hoping that the dialogue continues, because at the end of the day, our workforce is our lifeline. We will not have jobs without our workforce. So thank you very much for all of you.